The fifth console generation officially marked the coming of the third dimension. 3D games weren't exactly unheard of, but drawing, texturing, shading and animating large numbers of polygons in 3D space proved too difficult for the 16-bit consoles to do effectively. What better way then for market newcomer Sony to show their technological dominance over industry dinosaurs Nintendo than to go all in on this latest graphics technology, and at a price that undercuts Sega's Saturn by a full $100. What follows is a list of 10 games, none of which is rendered in boring old 2D, from the first entry in a console series that will go on to prominence in the video games industry over the following quarter century. Greetings YouTube humans, my name's Not Important, and this is the Top 10. Number 10. Metal Gear Solid. Years before Konami and Hideo Kojima's very public divorce, they were a winning team. Their collaboration brought us this stunning, innovative, cinematic stealth opera. Quite unlike anything that came before, inspirational for developers of long-form, story-driven action-adventure games ever since, and the coolest thing to be released on PlayStation in 1998. Metal Gear Solid is the 10th biggest seller on Sony's freshman platform with 6 million copies sold. Number 9. Tomb Raider 2. No sooner had developers' core design struck gold with their newly iconic hero Lara Croft, had they got back to work on producing a sequel. Tomb Raider 2 launched in 1997, and beyond the expected array of new enemies, weapons and locations, many of the minor issues players reported from the first game were ironed out. Tomb Raider 2 proved that the first game wasn't a fluke, selling 6.8 million copies worldwide. Number 8. Crash Bandicoot. The cynical might look at Crash Bandicoot as a slightly desperate attempt on Sony's part to jump on the animal mascot bandwagon. Thankfully, the less cynical could argue that the 1996 game from Sony stalwarts Naughty Dog also gave the new console a 3D platform game that actually worked. This wasn't a given, as many others tried and failed to make the transition, and Sony's gamble paid off. Crash Bandicoot sold 6.82 million units, just edging out Tomb Raider 2. Number 7. Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy fans in the 1990s and early 2000s were rather divided about which PS1 game was their favourite, but the sales figures speak for themselves. Final Fantasy VIII was visually distinct from its predecessor, and as is the tradition within the series, doesn't have any direct link to Final Fantasy VII. Nevertheless, though this may have confused fans expecting a direct sequel, they still managed to drive 7 million sales of what will become one of the most well-regarded games of the decade. Number 6. Tomb Raider. Lara Croft was a mid-90s phenomenon, starring on the cover of magazines, in ads and even some video games. This all began with 1996's breakout success, Tomb Raider. In what was already a legendary year for gaming, Tomb Raider in particular stood out, bringing amazing graphics, cinematic action and memorable set pieces to a story that was a contemporary take on the Indiana Jones theme. The first Tomb Raider sold 7.1 million copies on the PlayStation and launched a franchise that continues to this day. Number 5. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. A surprisingly late entry in the PlayStation Top 10, released at the end of 2001, this fairly loose adaptation of the box office hit movie didn't wow critics, but a hit IP on an established console doesn't have to be a groundbreaking work of art to make a shitload of money. This otherwise quite unremarkable film tie-in has child-friendly gameplay, a passable attempt at storytelling, and graphics that are pure nightmare fuel. It sold a, frankly, phenomenal 8 million copies. Number 4. Tekken 3. The Tekken series had its part in driving fighting games out of the arcade and back into the home since the first game hit PlayStation in 1995, and by 1997 Tekken 3 began to flex its dominance over old-fashioned 2D fighters like Mortal Kombat. With what were considered amazing graphics, responsive controls and even a storyline, Tekken 3 was and is considered one of the best fighting games of all time and sold 8.3 million discs. Number 3. Gran Turismo 2. Gran Turismo's success virtually guaranteed a sequel, and the much anticipated GT2 hit shelves 2 years later at Christmas 1999. Striving to improve on its predecessor in every way, it turned out to be a slightly overambitious goal, as despite rave reviews and huge sales, the game was clearly lacking some quality control, and as such was subject to some backlash. Despite its flaws, the game was immense fun, well polished and had a killer soundtrack. The number of discs that were returned or replaced is unknown, but the official sales figures for Gran Turismo 2 still stand at an impressive 9.37 million copies. Number 2. Final Fantasy VII. Some have called it the greatest game of all time. Square's magnum opus isn't a perfect game, and JRPGs aren't everyone's cup of tea, but at the time, it was arguably the best game of its kind. This now iconic game and its bold visual style, impactful music, epic story and really big sword was the must-have RPG of 1997. Press at the time credited Final Fantasy VII with being responsible for an increase of PlayStation console sales of 60%, and itself sold an incredible 9.8 million copies. Number 1. Gran Turismo. By 1997, racing simulators were getting pedestrian. The popular driving franchises of the day were arcade real-world racers like Daytona, edgy sci-fi games like Wipeout, or competitive cartoon racers like Crash Team Racing. You wanted a gaming event? Go check out a fighting game or FIFA. Enter Gran Turismo. GT began the tradition of racing simulators as consoles' killer apps. The graphics were incredible for the time, the car handling was realistic and made an analog controller a must, and the depth of gameplay was immense. The original Gran Turismo was the only game on the first PlayStation to hit unit sales of 8 figures, with 10.85 million games sold. And that's my list. Hope that brought back some good memories for you. If you enjoyed it, why not check out my other retro console top 10s, and before you go, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.